So I think to start out and just actually talk about what Max for Live is. So obviously this is Ableton Live, which I assume we're all sort of basically familiar with. And Max for Live is this thing that exists inside of Ableton. Max is actually a separate thing that's existed for a long time. It's been around since before Ableton. Actually, interestingly, the very first version of Ableton was built in this software called Max. So it's kind of cool that it all came full circle and Max got integrated into Ableton. And Max is this kind of programming language that lets you build musical tools, audio effects, instruments, MIDI effects. It's tailored for building sort of musical tools. As you'll see when we get into it, it's a little bit more accessible than like writing lines of code. Kind of almost is similar to like patching together a modular synth. So it's a little bit more accessible, like, so don't panic if you've never written code before. It's a lot easier to get into. But it's so similar to kind of like VSTs, if you're familiar with the idea of VSTs in Ableton Live, where you can add additional tools and instruments and effects. But the really cool thing about Max in particular is it's really deeply integrated with the software Ableton Live that lets you do really cool things that you can't do with Ableton. So I'll maybe show you a couple examples of some of the kinds of Max for Live devices that exist and sort of some of the things that you might be able to do with them. So for example, there are MIDI devices. So we might be familiar with MIDI devices in Ableton that we use to sort of process MIDI information. So something might look a bit like this thing over here. This device is hopefully it's not hidden behind that speaker. This is a Max for Live device. Quite often they look just like regular Ableton devices. If you didn't know that this was a Max device, you might think this was just some kind of built-in tool in Ableton. This is basically just like actually let's stick it on a different track. A really sort of, let's stick it on here. It's a bit loud. Sort of a step sequence device. And do some interesting stuff with it. But it generates MIDI data. So you have MIDI effects that can do all kinds of interesting things with MIDI. They can process it, they can create it. You have audio effects. Let me just turn this one off, actually. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the idea of audio effects that we can use to process audio information. You can build audio effects with Max for Live. So for example, this particular audio effect is, going to load up in a second, is a little tape machine type device. In fact, this is going to sound nice on some chords maybe. So I can go and make this like a wonky kind of tape machine. It's just an audio effect to process that information. Again, you can see kind of looks pretty much just like any other Ableton device. We have instruments. So just like Ableton comes with a bunch of built-in instruments, Max for Live has instruments as well. So this would be an example of a Max for Live instrument. Again, looks a lot like an Ableton device. I mean, I'm not going to go into too much detail on all these different devices and what they do, but this is a synthesizer that kind of does this weird sort of wave folding thing. One of the things you'll start to notice about Max devices is they tend to be like really creative and interesting. There's some really cool tools. Where we start to get a little bit more interesting with Max is if we move into the sort of category of devices called modulators. So all the things that we've seen so far are not like too different to a VST plugin. You get VST instruments, VST audio effects that can do a lot of these similar things. There's a whole sort of category of devices, and a really good example of this is called the LFO. What would be a good thing to load this on? I'm going to load it on this drum track, actually. If anyone's familiar with modular synthesis or just basic synthesis, you might be familiar with the concept of an LFO. It's this thing that lets you modulate parameters. Usually they're kind of hardwired to a particular parameter in a synth, but much like a modular synth, this is a modular LFO. And I can click this map button and click on anything in the Ableton interface, like this pan control, and it's modulated by this LFO. You can change the speed, etc. So like if I play a drum beat here, maybe I'll map this to the drum bus amount. Or maybe something better, something more interesting. Let's map this to, I could put a delay effect on this. And it lets you kind of modulate things that you otherwise would not be able to modulate. Let's map it to this. Yeah, it's modulating that delay time. Not the best example, but you can get pretty creative with it. And what you'll start to see, though, is this is the first sort of thing that we see that we can do with Max that you couldn't do with a normal VST plugin. We can modulate parameters inside of Ableton, which is pretty fun. And there's all kinds of things like, if I go back to my modulation devices, maybe a step sequencer that I can use to modulate something. So if I map this to, say, like the volume of my drums here, yeah, it's modulating the volume control with the step sequencer. You can start to sort of think of the really kind of creative, interesting things that you could do with those.
What's the name of that file?
It's called Sequence 8. So I didn't have actually a really good example to show for this one, but the next sort of category of devices is what I'd sort of broadly call extensions. I'm just going to hop over to the arrangement view for this. This is the best device I could kind of find that I sort of use regularly to do this. You get devices that let you kind of control sort of core functionality within Ableton. So for example, like in the arrangement, I've got this thing called this loop brace here. This device called Cartographer lets me control this loop brace. I can do interesting things where, let's just take it over here. When I play the track, this device is automatically going to jump. I'm not doing anything. You can see the loop brace there is jumping automatically in my arrangement according to that sort of cycle that I've set up in this cartographer device, which can be really interesting for like live performance. But the key here is that I'm manipulating an element of the application using Max for Live, which is really, really cool. And then sort of the last category of devices, going back over to here, is devices that let you route audio inside of Ableton. So a really kind of common example you'd probably all be familiar with is the idea of sidechain compression. Like Ableton's got the normal compressor device. I might have, so actually here's a good example, where I've got these chords and they're sidechained to the kick drum. So I'm using the signal from this drum track to compress the synth. You can do, and that's by routing audio around within Ableton. I'm sending audio from the drum track to the synth track or to the compressor on the synth track. So you can do that with Max for Live as well. A good example of that is there's this device that I use called Ducker, which is kind of somewhat like a sidechain compression type device where I can grab the audio from this drum track and I want to grab, not that one, I want to grab the kick drum. And you can see it's sort of picking up the kick drum signal and that's sidechaining these chords. So it does something similar to what the sidechain compressor does. It's just actually a really kind of yeah, it's sidechaining those chords. But the idea there is just to show you that being able to route audio around is sort of another thing that you can do with Max, which is pretty interesting. So that's something I'd really encourage you to do if you haven't already, is explore all the different Max for Live devices that might exist. And just to give you like a bit of a brief way to do that, there's sort of two places I would recommend checking out. One is maxforlive.com. This is a kind of community repository where anyone can upload Max for Live devices they've made. There's a pretty massive library of all different kinds of devices, audio devices, MIDI devices, some really weird ones that somehow use a cow in some way to make sound. So you see Max devices get pretty creative pretty quickly. So this is really sort of worth exploring to see some of the things that are available and what you can do with them. I have no idea what that device does. It's pretty interesting. So Max for Live is great. Maxforlive.com is great, but because it's just this community thing, there's a lot of stuff that can be pretty random and sometimes doesn't work or it doesn't really do anything interesting. So another place I'd recommend checking out So something that I recently put together for this exact reason. So this is my website for anyone who's not familiar. But I've put this thing together called the Curated Collection, which is basically just like I've gone and found Macs for Live devices that do really cool things and actually work and are well supported. So if you want to go check out a bunch of devices that do really cool things, yeah, this is a good place to go and check that out. So like some of those devices I've just showed you now are all listed in here. And some devices are free, some devices are paid. There's a whole range of things. It's not too dissimilar to VST plugins, but with that sort of added bonus of being able to do cool stuff to Ableton. So why would you want to actually learn to build these devices yourselves? Because you can just get by just using Macs for Live devices that other people have made, and there's like thousands and thousands of them available. And that's a great place to start, because there's some really cool stuff you can do. But one of the cool things about Macs is you can build these devices yourself or edit devices that other people have made. And it comes in really handy, particularly when you're trying to solve a problem that normal Ableton can't do. Or if you want to get a bit creative and build a weird, funky audio effect that uses a cow to manipulate your sound. All the way to like getting really advanced and building full-on instruments and synthesizers if you want to go there. But hopefully today we're going to go through like a really simple kind of device that will give you an idea of a really simple sort of useful device that doesn't take a lot of know-how to build, but actually has sort of a kind of a useful function. So what we're going to be building today is this little thing that I put together. So this very simple device over here, which is I've just called Note Chance. There's a single control. And this just defines the chance that a MIDI note is going to go through to my drum instrument. So at 100%, so this is what the drum beat sounds like. All those notes get passed through. But if I turn this down to like 50%, there's a 50% chance that any one of those notes is not going to play. And I get this kind of interesting, that's maybe too much, let's go to like 70%. Maybe let's go a bit higher than that. So every now and then there's like a little note that gets left out, makes that beat a little bit more interesting. And that's something that you couldn't really do. You probably could with like some complicated MIDI effects and macros and things. But for the most part, you couldn't really do with just native Ableton Live. So it's a really useful, really simple tool. And that's what we're going to build today. So first off, before we build something from scratch, any Macs for Live device that you see in Ableton, the sort of difference between normal Ableton devices and Macs for Live devices is a Macs for Live device has this little button over there. It's like a little, it's almost got like two plugs on the bottom and the top. And any Macs for Live device, whether you've made it yourself or somebody else has made it, you can click that button and it's going to open up the Macs editor. So this is actually a completely separate application called Macs, but it's sort of linked into Ableton. And as you make changes, they reflect in real time in Ableton, as we'll see. And we're going to build it from scratch, so we'll see all this now. But this is what that device looks like on the inside. Relatively simple as far as devices go. And we're going to learn what all these different things do. But so if I go just to maybe make a comparison, let's go into something a little more complicated, like let's go into this device here, this synth. And so this is something that somebody else made. I can open that up and I can see what that looks like inside. It is definitely a lot more complicated. There's quite a lot of things going on in there. So you can definitely get to that point where you're building kind of full-on instruments. Maybe like a sort of middle-of-the-road thing to show you is just one of the devices that I've made myself. Some of you might know, this is like a notepad, pretty simple. You can just put notes in here to save them in your session. Looks like this on the inside. So that's kind of all there is. So maybe slightly less complicated than the instrument, a bit more complicated than the MIDI effect, but you can kind of wrap your head around it. So let's build, I'm going to delete this Note Chance device, and we're going to build something from scratch. So when you start building a Macs for Live device from scratch, there's three kinds of devices you could build. You could either build an audio effect, an instrument, or a MIDI effect. And just some basics around that if you're not super familiar with it in live. Same thing in Ableton. There's 3 different kinds of devices that you get. So a MIDI effect works with MIDI information. That is things like the arpeggiator is probably the one most people are familiar with, but there's all kinds of other things. And those usually go before your instrument. So if you've got like a synthesizer or a drum rack, your MIDI devices go before that and they process that MIDI information. Instruments take that MIDI information and convert it into sound using synthesizers or a sampler, or in this case, like a drum rack. They take that MIDI info. So MIDI info is like the notes that you play. And then audio effects take the audio from that synthesizer and process that, things like delays, reverbs. So you'll be familiar, kind of vaguely familiar with those 3 types of devices. So Max for Live lets you build those 3 different kinds of devices as well. So first you obviously have to decide what is the kind of device that you want to build. And so in this case, we're wanting to process the MIDI notes with that sort of chance. So we're going to be building a Max MIDI effect. It's also sort of the easiest place to start. Within this Max MIDI effect category, in fact, within each Max category, right at the top, you'll find these kind of basic devices. Here it says Max MIDI effect. You'll see like Max instrument, Max audio effect. And if I load this up onto my track, this is now a basic blank Max device with sort of some starting points in it. But it's a starting point for us to now build our device from. And so again, instruments, audio effects, they'll load up in their respective place. So to start building this device, I click that little Max button again, and it's going to open up the Max editor. Let's make this nice and big. Cool. So there's quite a lot going on in here if this is kind of your first time in Max. There's toolbars along all sides, but for now, don't worry about those. We'll get into each kind of one as we need to, each sort of menu item. And in fact, honestly, like a lot of these you barely even use. The most important part when we're getting started out is right up here in the top left. This is kind of the bare bones of a basic MIDI device, MIDI Max for Live device. And the way Max for Live works is it works with these things called objects. You'll see I've got 2 objects in this patch. One's called MIDI in, one's called MIDI out. And you connect objects together with patch cables. So like I said, there's no like written lines of code, although if you know things like JavaScript or C++, you can do that in Max, but that's a bit more advanced. Most of the things you build work with these objects, and there's like a predefined library of objects that do certain things, and we connect them together with patch cords, very similar to like a modular synth. So in this case, the MIDI in object is the MIDI input. It takes MIDI data that's coming from Ableton, brings it into our Max patch where we can do all kinds of things with it, and then that connects to the MIDI output and goes back out to our to Ableton Live. So as an example, if I go over to Ableton, if I play this beat now, plays as per normal. If I delete this patch cable, so I just click on it, press backspace, I'm not getting anything now because the MIDI information is no longer passing through this device. I've broken that connection. To make a connection between 2 objects, you hover over what's called the outlet, which is at the bottom of an object, and you connect it to the inlet, which is up at the top of another object. And I've made that connection again. I'll leave that off now so we don't have the sound. These other things are just called comments. These are like little text hints that you can use throughout building your device. These just sort of appear in the default device. I'm going to delete those for now. So let's think about what we want to do in this device. I mean, as you'll see, I can kind of move these objects around. A good place to start when you're building a Max for Live device, and anyone who's done any kind of coding will know about this idea of sort of pseudo-code, is thinking about what is it that you want to do in your device or your tool, whatever it is, and writing it out in plain text. And we can use these comments to do that. So to create a new object in Max, there's a couple different ways that we can do this. You've got all these menus at the top, which you can click on. Should be able to click on that, and there we go. So it's created over here. And it creates a new object. So in this case, it's created a blank object. The next one along, you'll hover, I see it says message. It creates this thing called a message. which we're going to get to. This one says comment. You can see it's created this comment over here. So you've got these menus up at the top that you can use to create all kinds of different Max objects. So we want the comment for now. You'll also notice that a lot of them have shortcuts, and always good to learn your shortcuts. So like comment is being hidden by the mouse there, but it's C, lowercase c. I can just put my mouse anywhere and press the letter C, creates a comment. And I'm going to call this, I'm just going to type no chance device, because that's what we're going to build. And we're going to say, have a control from 0 to 100% that determines the chance a note plays. So that's kind of the basics of what this device is going to do. And so if we think a bit about like how might we do this, so you need to sort of start thinking about logic as well when you're building these devices. Is we've got this MIDI information going through, and maybe what we want to do is we want to generate some kind of random number and say, if this note is going to be higher than this random number, play the note. If it's lower than the random number, don't play the note. So let's say that. So we're going to create a random number, and we'll just say, if higher, play note. If lower, don't. So this is just going to sort of function as a basic skeleton for us to go back to and remember how we're going to make this device work. Cool. So let's get to some building. The first thing we need to do when we're working in a MIDI Max device is interpret this MIDI data, because MIDI data comes in as like a whole bunch of stuff in one. We've got the note values, the velocity, things like MIDI channel, and this basic MIDI in just has all of that kind of lumped together. So we're going to learn our first Max object here. And to create a new object, you can click this button up here, but the quickest way to do that is just hit the N key. And to create an object, the more you use Max, the more you kind of learn about what these different objects are. You just start typing in the object name, and you'll learn all the different names. Max has this really handy like autocomplete, where as soon as you start typing something, it'll start coming up with available objects for you, and gives you a little hint of sort of what these things might do. So like MIDI format prepares data in the form of a MIDI message. MIDI pass, interpret raw MIDI data. So that's actually what we want to do. We want to interpret this raw MIDI data. So I'm going to click on that, and I have MIDI pass. And it creates this object for me. So if I hover over this inlet at the top, you'll see it says MIDI pass, MIDI message input. And if I hover over the bottom, which is the output of MIDI in, it says raw MIDI messages. So I can connect the output, these raw MIDI messages, to this MIDI message input. Now, if I hover over the bottom of this MIDI pass on each of these outputs, it tells you what kind of information you get out of that. So this leftmost output says note on and note off, which is pitch and velocity. This is poly key pressure, so that's like, if you've got a pressure-sensitive controller, control change messages, program change. There's all this sort of MIDI stuff in here. All we're actually interested in at the moment is the MIDI notes, because we want to sort of set the chance that a note is going to play. So again, referring back to our pseudocode. So what we're also actually going to do is, we know at the end, this MIDI out only takes raw MIDI messages, not all these kind of separate MIDI messages. So we need to set up another object, which is going to take all that MIDI that we've split up, and we're going to combine it again. So we'll type MIDI, and if you remember, it came up before, this object called MIDI format says prepare data in the form of a MIDI message. And what you'll notice is at the inlets at the top here, it actually has a lot of the same things that we saw at the outputs of the MIDI pass. So like poly key pressure, control change. And so if I connect this to my MIDI out, and I connect up these sort of corresponding inputs and outputs, so note on, I connect here, there are my notes again. I'll delete that for now. And what I might do is, I know I'm not going to want to affect anything other than the note data. So I'm just going to take all this other MIDI information, because I don't want to lose that. I might be using it for something, and I'm just going to connect it all up so it's still getting sent to this MIDI out. Because all I'm interested in is this note data. I want to do some interesting stuff too. So we're going to grab that and do some things. So what I want to do is I want to generate some kind of random number, and I want to be able to compare, is something bigger than this random number? If it is, let the note go through. I might have to go back to my Max device to just remind myself of some of the things that I said, but it should be pretty straightforward. So to do that, I'm going to create a new object called random. So again, like I'm able to just sort of call up these objects because I know what a lot of them are. But the more you use Max, the more you get familiar with a lot of these objects do. I'll show you ways that you can learn about new objects. And what this random object does is it generates for us a random number. How do we know that? How do we see what's actually happening with this? There's a couple useful tools that we can use in Max to kind of get some insights into what things are doing. The first thing is something called a bang message. And to create a bang, the shortcut for that is just B. If you type B, it creates this thing, which is a button. And I can connect that to the input of this random device. Essentially, a bang is like a button press. It's just saying, like, do something.
Bang or bang?
Bang, B-A-N-G, bang. I don't know why the term bang, where that comes from, but that's what it's called in Max. Yeah, exactly, like bang, do something. The other thing that's really useful that you use a lot in Max is called a message box. And to create that, you press the M key, M for message, very straightforward. A lot of these, again, just remember you can kind of go up to the top here and you can see there's message and it says M. My mouse is a bit too big. But why message boxes are really useful for us at this stage is they let you see what things do. They let you see the output of certain things. So if I connect this random object to this message box, and I click this button, I bang this button, it's going to make the random do its thing, and it's going to send an output to this message box. You'll see that I can't click on this straight away, because obviously I click on it, I select it. So when you're editing a Max patch, there's kind of two states that you have, called unlocked and locked. Unlocked is when you're sort of editing the patch. If we want to play around in the patch and actually do things, we have to lock it. Way down the bottom left there, there's a little lock icon. And now you'll see I can click on that button. And you would have seen as soon as I clicked that, the number 0 appeared in this message box. The random gave me 0. And if I keep clicking that, I keep getting 0. So we want this random number to give us, this random object to give us some random numbers, not just 0. So the next step, so first we've got to unlock our patch down at the bottom here. Shortcut for that is Command or Control E. Very useful to remember because you'll use that a lot. So I can go in and edit here. We have to change this random object a little bit, and this introduces us to another kind of important concept, which is this idea of what's called arguments. So a lot of objects, when you're creating them in Max, you type the name of the object, so I type random. If I hit the space bar, you can see it changes here and it says arguments. An argument is basically just like a preset for an object. I'm kind of defining some values that I want it to have. Not all things have to have arguments, but a lot of things do, and they can be quite important. So for example, this random number, the argument I need to set to it is what range of randomization do I want? And because I didn't set an argument, it's just giving me 0 because the range is 0. And so if I type in 100, you can see it says int, which stands for integer. We'll explain that a little bit more later on. I'm going to type 100, and I click out. Now if I lock my patch, Command E, and I, again, bang that message, now you can see I'm getting some random numbers. And you can kind of probably see that they're sort of roughly in the range of 0 to 100, somewhere between 0 and 100. If I go in and I change this argument to 10, now you'll see I'm only going to get random numbers. In fact, it's actually between 0 and 9, not between 1 and 10. If anyone's done code, you'll be familiar with the idea that usually in most kind of coding environments, you start at 0. So 0 would be 1. So if you've got 10 numbers, it's going to be 0 to 9. So if we wanted to, just as a simple example, if we wanted to get between 1 and 10, what we might do is we could say, actually, we want to add 1 to this random number output. And there's a Max object that does that. So we just do n, and we say plus 1. So the object itself is plus, adds 2 numbers, and then we can give it an argument, so we hit space, which is the initial value that we want to add. So I say plus 1, and I'm going to stick that in between the random object and this message box. And so now you'll see I'm getting between 1 and 10. every time I click that random button. So very basic patch. Random is great because random is one of the things that like you probably use quite a lot because randomization you can do very fun, interesting things with. It's a really good sort of object to be aware of. Cool. So let's set this to 100 because we're going to use percentage, 0 to 100. That sort of makes sense. And what we want to do is we want to say every time a note comes in, we want to generate a new random value and we want to be able to check that value against something else. So what we can do is we can take this note information that we've got here and I can actually connect it to this bang. And what you'll see, it's going to start flashing because I've still got that MIDI data playing in the background. Let's connect up a message box again. And so if I just connect this so that MIDI data passes through, you can see every time a note plays, the great thing about bangs is you can kind of connect anything to it, and it just, anytime it receives a message, it sends a bang. It becomes really useful in certain patches. So I'm taking that MIDI information, I'm just saying, generate, whenever you see a new note, generate a random number. Then what I want to do is I want to be able to control this. I want to set a range from like 0 to 100. So I'm going to create a control for my device. Again, I'm going to hit N. There's a number of different like controls that you get. There's dials, sliders, number boxes, and there's also a whole range of objects that are specifically for Ableton. And to find all these Ableton-specific objects, you just start typing live, as in Ableton Live, and you'll see it gives you these list of all these different live objects that you get. So like live slider is like an Ableton slider control, or live.dial, live.text. These are all kind of user interface objects for Ableton. So let's go live.dial. That just gives me a basic control that goes from 0 to 127. And what I want to do is I want to compare the value of this control to my random number output to see if the random number is bigger than my control value. If you remember our patch here, if it's bigger than the control value, give me something out. So I'm going to use another max object, which is the less than sign. If you're familiar with the less than sign from maths, we can use that to compare things. So compare numbers for less than condition. Or I could do it the other way and it's greater than or equal to, etc. And so what this object does is it lets me compare two messages and it gives me an output when the one is less than the other. So if I connect my control to this one here and I connect my random, and again, message box. So message boxes are really useful because you can sort of see the output. At the moment, I'm getting a 0, although occasionally, I'll tell you why I'm not getting a 1 at the moment. It's because usually I've got to actually just set the value that goes in here. Even though I've connected this control, at the moment, this object hasn't actually received that value of 81. So let me just set that to like 50. And you'll see this is jumping between 0 and 1. In fact, let's set up another message box so I can see what's coming out of this random number output. And you'll see every time this random number is less than 50, it should give us a 1. So like in coding, 1 is generally like yes, 0 is no, like on and off. So it's moving pretty quickly, but maybe let me just detach this and I can do it manually. So below 50, so I get a 1. Above 50, I get a 0. So that's pretty useful because I can use this to turn certain things on and off. 0 is off, 1 is on. So I'll leave those message boxes there so we can always kind of see what's coming out. And I'm going to use something called a gate. A gate is a really simple object that you put a bit of information into it, and you can open and close the gate. You get a 0, gate's closed, 1, the gate's open. It's exactly what we needed to do. So let's just kind of pause at this point and actually say, well, how did I know that? How the heck do I know what this gate object does? I've obviously used this a bunch before. One of the things that's kind of actually quite great about Max, and a way to sort of learn more about how Max works, is any of these objects, you can right-click on them, and you have this thing called help. And I can say, open the gate help. And that opens up this little page, which actually itself is a Max patcher. You can go in and you can edit this. It's an actual patch that gives you an example of what this particular thing does. So it says pass input to an outlet, and it says here 0, all outlets are off, 1 opens the first outlet, 2 opens the second outlet, because you can have multiple different outlets if you want. And it gives you this little example of a patch. So you have these help files, which we'll come back to those. You also have what's called the reference. So I can go and open the gate reference. And this is kind of a slightly more detailed explanation of what this does. Again, pass input to an outlet, but it tells you a little bit more about what this object does. So for example, it says it's got certain arguments that you can do. It says you can tell how many outlets do you want, how many outputs do you want from this device. And it'll tell you what happens when it receives certain messages. So when this gate object receives a bang, it says it reports the current open outlet. It says which of our outputs is currently open. If it receives an integer number, then this number is going to specify an outlet through which to pass all messages. So there's all this information. I'm not going to go into this now, but this is how you kind of learn what different objects do in Macs. And one of the ways to sort of learn how to build Macs devices is to study other people's Macs devices. Open something up. One of the great things about Macs is it's super accessible. You can open it up and you can see, and then you can go in and any of the objects that exist in somebody else's patch, just right-click and go reference. What does this thing do? Or go to the help file, and sort of between those two, you can kind of work out what this object does. So it's a really good way to sort of see how people build things. So we know that this gate object, the left inlet, you can also hover over the inlet, and it sort of tells you what happens when you send something in there. So when it receives a message in this inlet, if it gets a 0, it closes the gate. If it gets a non-zero, so anything other than 0, it's going to open the gate. This one on the right is the incoming gated message. That's the actual thing I want to control whether it's going through. So I want to gate my note messages using this kind of random function. So the message I want to gate is my note messages. So I'm going to connect that to the right one, which is the incoming gated message. This one over here, the gate output, which says currently closed, by default it'll be closed. I'm going to connect that to my MIDI note. So when the gate, basically now when the gate is open, it's going to send that MIDI information through. When it's closed, it won't. Really simple way we can see this is I'm just going to press T, creates what's called a toggle, basically an on-off switch. And I can connect that to my gate. When I turn it on, I open the gate, messages go through, turn it off, close the gate. Pretty straightforward. But again, I want to be able to do that using this random number here. So let's connect back up our note. Every time a note plays, it's going to create a message. So we've got our 0 and 1. And all I need to do now is connect this less than to the gate. And there we go. I've got my max patch. If I set this to 0, because remember we're using a less than, obviously nothing's going to be less than 0, so I get no notes. If I set it all the way to the max, it's always going to be less than 127, so it always goes through. So there's kind of my very basic note chance patch. So there's a couple extra things that we need to do here. First of all, this dial goes from 0 to 127. We want it to go from 0 to 100. So a very important area within Macs is this thing called the inspector. So if I unlock this patch, I select this live dial. Over on the right here, of all the kind of like side menus, the one you probably use the most is this one on the right. There's some sort of important stuff here. The inspector lets us set a bunch of information about different objects. And you can click on any of these objects and you'll see they have sort of different things in the inspector where you can set certain parameters for it. A lot of these are like kind of things that you can mostly ignore. So yeah, more sort of detailed stuff. Even things like kind of the color of the control you could set here. Most of the time where you're going to go to the inspector for is like for interface devices where you want to set, or objects, interface objects, where you want to set some kind of parameters. Like you want to set the range of the device or the name of the device, the object. I don't want this to be called live dial. I want it to be called chance or something. In the inspector, there's sort of 4 different panels that you can have, which show different elements of that object. I'm going to go to all, which is going to show me everything that's available for that. And so here I can do things like I can change the display style. Is this a vertical slider? Is it a tiny, you can see it's made that a tiny dial. Is it a large dial? In fact, I'm going to leave it as a large dial because we're only going to have one control in this. You can do things like change the color. So like the control on color, if I want to make that like red, I can do that. So I can completely kind of customize my interface if I really want to. Scrolling down a bit further, I can see things like parameter and things like name over here. So I've got like long name, short name. So these you'll sort of learn what each one means, but these relate to in Ableton Live. Short name is the one that shows up on the control. So if I change this to chance, you'll see that now says chance. Long name is what shows up when you go in Ableton to the automation chooser. You know, when you're setting up automation, you go into like the drop-down menus. Long name is what shows up there. Because maybe sometimes you want to like, maybe you want to call this chance of note. And that's obviously like too long to fit on the control. So the short name is good for the control, but the long name kind of gives you a bit more information. You'll see it in the automation in Ableton. Also here, you'll see I can set things like the range. So the range is the range of values that this outputs. So from 0 to 127, I'm just going to type 0 to 100. And well, I'll sort of discuss the difference between floating points and integers now. And so you should see now this dial goes from 0 to 100, which is what we want. Also, sort of going down a bit further, you can do things like set the unit style. Unit style is the thing that displays after the number. So at the moment, it's just showing integers. But we want this to be like a percentage chance. So I'm going to set this to be %. And now you'll see on that control, it's given me a percentage sign. So that could be like milliseconds or note values, or it's going to be different depending on the different context. And that's just for a display thing. It's not going to change the kind of output that you get. So now it's %. So there's all kinds of things that you might get into and change into the inspector. And again, you'll learn more about some of those different things as you go on. So the last thing we need to do is actually make this accessible to Ableton. If I save this device now, so you can see it's still there. It hasn't reflected our changes yet because I've got to save the device. And I'm going to call this, I've already got a device called Note Chance. I'm going to call it Chance. Chance the Noter. There we go. Chance the Noter. And I'm going to save it. And you'll see as soon as I saved it, this has changed. I've got this monstrously wide device, which is obviously not ideal. Because when we're working with devices in Ableton, there's one sort of step that we have to take. If I have nothing selected, if I just click in a blank area, you'll see you get this button up at the top that kind of looks like a P. That's called the Patcher Inspector, and that gives you sort of parameters for your whole patch. Patches are just what you call the devices in Macs. So if I click on that to open the Patcher Inspector, here I can set like global things, like what's the background color of the patch. I can give it a name. There's all kinds of other sort of things in here. Most of the time you don't need to change these. The most important one that you always do need to change though is this one over here that says open in presentation. And that's because presentation mode is the mode we're all familiar with. It's the interface of a device. So not presentation mode is what we're seeing now, the guts of the device. You can leave it like that if you want that to be visible at the end of the day and you want to see all those little bits and pieces. That's totally fine. But most of the time you want to say open in presentation. So if I save this now, cool, I've got my small little device, but there's nothing in my presentation at the moment. So you actually need to add certain things to your presentation because how does Max know what I want to see in my interface? And so all you do is any object that you want to show up, you right-click on it, right-click, come on, and you say add to presentation. You'll notice it gets like a little red ring around it, so you know that it's in the presentation. And then the last thing is heading down to the bottom here. This bottom toolbar is probably also something that you kind of head to quite a lot. Looks like a little slide deck icon. This switches us into what's called presentation mode, and presentation mode lets us see what our device is going to look like in Ableton. This line sort of gives you, because obviously devices in Ableton are only so big. So again, if I save this, even though I've added this chance control, it's made my device wider because it's off to the right here, but it's kind of below that line, so I can't see it. So if I just drag this over and I save again, there's that chance control. And so to see it update, you always have to save, so I'm just doing Command S, so I can just kind of position that where I want. If you want to live preview a device, so you can interact with it in Ableton while you're building it, you've got this control over here. If you click that, I can interact with this device as I'm building it, which is pretty fun. Go over to Max, And that's it. I can save that device. Usually, like just best practice is you lock the device before you kind of close Max. There's this other thing here called freezing, but that's for slightly more advanced devices. And then I can quit Max. I can close this window. I can just go quit Max. And I now have a functioning device. If I delete this, this is going to show up in the Max for Live category. You'll see, usually you just have to kind of go out of it and then back into it for Ableton to refresh. If I look for Chance the Noter, there's Chance the Noter, and I can load that up just like any other Ableton device. And there it is. I can open it up again. And it's going to open the Max interface if I want to go in and make some tweaks. Because in fact, one thing that you'll see, just speaking of tweaks, is when I load this device, so if my thing's playing, if I load this device, notice how it defaults to 0, it just goes off straight away. Maybe I don't want that. Maybe I want it to default to 100. So again, that's something that I can set in the inspector. So I'm going to open this device. Any parameter, if I select that and open the inspector, you'll see there is, if I scroll all the way down, there's this thing that says initial enable. So I want to tick that. And then I can set an initial value. The initial value is what the value of that control will be when you load it up. So say 100. And again, I'll save the patch, lock it, quit. So now if I delete this and load it up, it loads up at 100%. So that is our first very basic Max device, but hopefully introduces us to some like really kind of fundamental concepts in Max. And in fact, that kind of covers like 90% of the most fundamental things in Max, and everything else is just learning different objects and what different objects do, and then thinking about how the logic applies. But if we just go look at that patch and the basics of that. So the things that we learned is that we've got objects that do different things, and you can learn about what different objects do by going into the right-clicking and going into the help file. Also, what can be quite useful is over on the left-hand side, there's actually an object menu that lists all the available objects in Max. You can see there's a lot of them. It can be quite fun to just open this and like scroll and go, oh, cool, int, stores an integer value. And you can kind of pick up on different objects like that. There's quite a lot of them, so it's not the best idea. But if you are just wanting to sort of see some of the things that might exist, you can just sort of scroll through this and find things. So like live.button, cool. It's a button, and you can actually drag any of those directly in, and it will add that to your patch. So that can be a way to learn about all the different objects. We learned that so objects have inlets and outlets. So inlets like an input, outlets like an output, and they might have different kinds of messages. And we connect objects with patch cables using their inlets and outlets. Some other sort of really important stuff is like message boxes are really useful for kind of monitoring things and seeing what the output of certain things are. There's other uses for message boxes as well. Buttons or bangs are really good for like triggering things to get them to do stuff. We've got interface elements like this live dial. And there's all kinds of other objects that do various different things. But really just kind of knowing those basics is a good sort of starting point to going off and being able to build all kinds of other different devices. So maybe before we do some questions and then break, and then we can come back and look at some like more advanced stuff. We'll build an audio effect as well, just to give you a couple more resources to sort of go on from this and learn a bit more on your own. There's a couple kind of really good places to learn, but they're a little bit hidden in terms of being able to actually find them. So Max actually has a bunch of really nice built-in tutorials, but in order to find them, you've got to go to the Help menu and then go to Reference. And this is going to open up this big reference, which we were there earlier, remember when we were looking at the gate. But in the reference, if you go Home, you'll see you've got all these different categories down the left-hand side here. And you can open up these different categories, so for example, Max, and there are tutorials within each. So if I go in there, there's a whole bunch of these tutorials, and these are really kind of nice ones to start with, these Max ones. And you can walk through all of them. They'll have like an example. All of them have like an example patcher. That is actually a patcher you can like unlock, and you can edit it and change it if you want. And you can right-click on these and see what they do. But it sort of walks you through some of the basics. So these basic Max tutorials are really good, and you can kind of follow them at your own pace. There's this thing in Max. So Max is like the basic programming languages, like things like the buttons and the gate and the less than, like the math symbols is all what's called Max. Then you have what's called MSP, which is audio specific. So things like distortions, delays are all MSP objects where they process audio. So we can maybe look at that after the break. And so you'll see if you go into the MSP tutorials, it starts talking about audio and how you can generate sounds and add effects and things. You can also process visuals in Max, which is pretty cool. And that part of Max is called jitter. And again, there's tutorials for that if you want to get into the visual stuff, a bit more advanced. Gen is like if you know how to write C++ code, that's like way mega super advanced. But if you're interested in learning about Gen and like you can actually build your own objects, which is pretty fun. And then like Max for Live as well. There's some guides on like Max for Live specific stuff. But for the most part, I'd really recommend just going through all these Max tutorials to get started. They give you a good idea of the basics and then some of these MSP tutorials. So that's pretty cool. The other place that's really useful is the Cycling74 YouTube channel. I recently cleared my browser history, so I'm not like logged into anywhere. So my YouTube's going to be just like the random home feed. But if I search for Cycling74, the people who make Max. So even though like Max for Live is built into Ableton, Max is still a separate kind of application, which is made by this company called Cycling74. And they have got some cool playlists. There's a whole bunch of them. But this one in particular, Programming in Max for Live, is a really good like video tutorial if you're into watching videos. That's a really good playlist for kind of walking through some of the basics. And it actually walks you through like building basic audio effects and things, which is pretty fun. By the end of it, you've kind of basically built a simple synth and a step sequencer. So that's quite cool. So that's also sort of really worth checking out. But then of course, within Max, all those help files are also really useful in sort of dissecting other people's patches.